Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Calvin Normore for our final session of the day, who's presenting virtually from I think Los Angeles, and his topic is thinking together about the world. And I will make myself scarce from up here so that you can focus entirely on Calvin's glorious visage. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank all of the organizers for holding the meeting, of course, for organizing it, but especially in my case for allowing me to present virtually and for putting up with a change of title as well as it happens. I owe many apologies. Uh, my, I very much wish I could have been with you. But as those of you teaching in U.S. universities right now, I'm sure know, um, things like graduate admissions are now in complete chaos. And I'm the chair of graduate admissions here. Our prospectives are visiting as I speak, and everything is being done on the fly. So in fact, although I've been able to attend the earlier talks for the most part, I've had to come and go because there are things here, even things like, can we admit someone, that are being decided on the fly. Okay, so so that's apology first. There'll be more, but let me begin by by saying that this talk will, I think, follow on Dr. Klinger's talk in a way quite naturally. And to my mind, surprisingly, I really was blown away by what Dr. Klinger had found in Razi, for example. But let me begin just by taking us through some of it. So here's a claim, right? That William Occam's view that thought is carried out in what he and we would consider a language is well known. Well known also at one level is his account of the relation between that language, the mental language of thought, and the natural languages we speak and write. But less well known is that Occam and some who followed him, notably Pierre Dailly, allowed for and to some extent relied on a dependence of mental language on spoken language, which opens up a social dimension in their accounts of the language of thought that hasn't been much explored. And that's what I hope to introduce to you today. This has all come as a kind of revelation to me. I had originally intended to give you a paper I thought I had well worked out on rationality and sinning. When I realized that the meeting was really about minds in dialogue, I began to think, what about the social aspect of thought? And this has led me here. Okay. Now, as I think now, I guess, the we, for the most part, think of thinking that is done by individuals. But I think in at least the later Middle Ages, no, in fact, I think throughout the Middle Ages, there were very um, different views. Perhaps the majority view was that thought was carried out by individuals, but it was certainly not the only view. And I think the view that thought is carried out by individuals goes back, of course, to antiquity, but it's exactly unclear, or it's unclear to me anyway, exactly how it was supposed to go. So, on Aristotle's view, it does look like thinking is something that's private, right? And he has very little to say actually about how thought and language are related, although he has a lot to say about each one. And of course, his view is that we encounter substances with their accidental forms. Whether we have concepts directly connected with those substances is very unclear. We don't have an organ for processing substantial forms. And how we do it is actually somewhat obscure, right? But at least he has uh, a, a picture of thought modeled on perception, and that looks, at least at first glance to me, like it's fundamentally individualistic. But so the the objects of our thought are the forms of hylomorphic composites, right? Both substantial and accidental. And then there's something which plays the role in thought that light is said by him to play in perception, and he calls that nous poetikos. And then there's the imagination, in which what comes into the individual in already in some peculiar form, and of course there's lots of debate about whether the organ is spiritually affected or physically affected and so on. And then we get, further kinds of change. All that's familiar to all of you. Now, but it's the obscurity in how this works that I think led in antiquity to the suggestion that there was an entity distinct from any human being, namely the active intellect, which literally had these substantial forms in some sense and implanted it in us, right, on an occasion. So, in a very limited sense, maybe we could say that constitutes a kind of social picture. There are two entities at work, right? There's the active intellect and you. But that far, at least, our own thinking in no way depends on there being other human beings around. If it were just the active intellect and you could think just as well, right, as you do in a social context, it seems. Now, if you look at the way Alexander develops that picture, right, he takes the idea of the active intellect. He takes what's apparently in you, right, the material intellect, a part of the soul, and he takes up Aristotle's idea that that is in some sense actualized by what happens with encounter with the active intellect. And I think that picture is more or less shared by Christian illuminationists. But I really don't have much to say about that, and I won't say now. But that picture, at least, I think, reached its zenith in Ibn Rushd. And Ibn Rushd, of course, is famous for having done one other thing, namely introducing not only an external active intellect, but in some important way, an external passive intellect, right? So he has, as Alexander does, for example, an active intellect, a passive intellect, and what's called an acquired intellect, the material intellect once it receives the form. But both the active intellect and the passive intellect are external to us. Again, is this a social picture? Well, perhaps in a very limited sense, right? Now, what makes it in a way more puzzling is that for Ibn Rushd, right, um, we are our intellect, right? So he even goes to say that the dat, the dahu of an individual is nothing but their knowledge, their ilm, right? Um, so that's what it is to be, and what it is to be is not in you, right? So it looks like, um, in some curious way, we're our only, well, in Martin Tweedale's poignant phrase, right, dumb terminals attached to a server, and the server is what does all the thinking. And it's not social in any ordinary sense. And we don't actually do the thinking, properly speaking, right? So here's the text of Vandenberg's translation, right? The Dhyana commentary in which he lays this out, right? The intellect apprehends in relation to the individuals which have a common species a single entity in which they participate and which is the quiddity of this species without this entity being divided into the things in which the individuals are divided, like space and position, and the matters to which they receive their plurality. Right? And so this is thinking, right? This is what thinking is. And there's only a very limited sense in which we do it at all. Very odd view. And everybody agrees it's a very odd view. Now, of course, he does think, Ibn Rushd does think that we are distinct in some way. Exactly how is a good question. Here's another text from Vandenberg's translation in which he he lays this out. We have distinct imaginations. We have distinct sensory organs. What we don't have is a distinct capacity for thought, right? So social, hard to say, right? Not very social as we would understand it. And so it's no surprise, I think, that Aquinas and others would reject this picture, uh, insisting that it's we and not something else that does our thinking, right? Now, as I understand Aquinas's picture, and Aristotle's for that matter, I take it there's no essential dependence of my thinking on anyone else's, right? I mean, of course, God creates us all, and we wouldn't be here without God, and so on, and we can't continue to be here without God. But there's nothing essential about this. Sorry, about my thinking, right? If God just made me, I could, and somehow manage to keep me alive and so on. I could navigate the world. I could encounter objects. I could receive forms. I could do whatever it is I do with forms, and it wouldn't matter whether you were there or not. I mean, yeah, in fact, of course, it would matter to each of us whether others were there, but not for our thinking, it would seem. And it's very unclear to me whether in Aristotle and Aquinas you find anything quite like a linguistic structure to thinking. And this came up, of course, in Dr. Klinger's remarks about in the previous talk and in his book, which I've just downloaded. I didn't even know it had been published yet, on the copula in Arabic, because of course in Arabic you don't have a copula in the ordinary present tense case. And so you don't have a straightforward way linguistically to distinguish thinking something like Socrates pale and, Socrates is pale. And so, but yet, of course, we do think we can distinguish those two. And so it's an interesting question how we do it, whether or not what we do is have thoughts of Socrates and thoughts of pale, and just having those thoughts somehow gives us the propositional form, or whether we have to add something to it to get the propositional form is, of course, something of a puzzle, which I hope to discover more of in Dr. Klinger's book. All that by way of background in a certain sense, because what there does emerge in the 14th century, I think, is a picture of thought as having the very same kind of structure that spoken languages have, right? A picture of thought as communication, I'm going to say. Now, this is controversial, and in fact, it forces me to take back things I've said in print, and I wish I were sure of what I'm going to say. So here is a little bit from Dr. Klinger's translation from the Shifa that I just downloaded from the the, the handout, where Avicenna says, necessity requires the use of utterances. It's inconceivable for reason to arrange concepts without imagining their utterances alongside them, reasoning being almost a dialogue between a man's mind and imagined utterances. Now, notice how that already, and this, as I say, blew me away because I had no idea that Avicenna thought this, seems to suggest that, yeah, perhaps I can have the concept of Socrates and the concept of pale, but unless I have language, I can't arrange them, right? And so I will need something like a spoken language in order to be able to think propositionally rather than simply to think, Socrates, or think pale, or think even pale Socrates. Okay, so mental language, as the 14th century people began to understand, it really is a language, right? So just as spoken words can be combined into sentences, so the view is that concepts can be combined into mental sentences. And that process and the movement in the intellectual soul from one such mental sentence to another, that just is thinking for these 14th century people I'm going to talk about. Okay, now, everybody, that's not news. And at first blush, Occam's mental language seems to be as individualistic as anything before it. And so in the past have I interpreted it. Occam supposes that our minds acquire our mental language in stages that begins with a sensory encounter, right? So the idea is we encounter an object, we we are able to sense the object. Various forms are in the object, but we don't. But those forms, on Occam's view, don't pass to us. Instead, what happens is and he never says much about how this actually works. We form a concept. In the best case, we form a concept of that very object, as that very object, if you like. And then we seem to have an innate power to generalize from that very concept to a concept of the kind, the species of thing which that concept, which that thing has. And it might be that we have to encounter more than one object of a species in order to form this more general concept. But it looks like all we need at that stage is a sensory encounter and this apparently innate capacity to generalize. And of course, at that point, we've got concepts, and there's nothing preventing us from, tying some sound or some mark to that concept. That's something we could do if we have such a thing available. But notice nobody else is involved in that process at all. So the thought is we have causal encounters with particular objects. Under the best conditions, these generate concepts which are of those very individual things. And Occam goes on famously to say this puts us in a position to assert evidently that the things exist. If they do, and curiously, he goes on to claim that if the things cease to exist, and we continue to have that very concept, we're now in a position to assert evidently that the things don't exist, right? And we have this innate machinery for generating more general concepts. Now, the concepts are of the individuals, right? Occam does not think we have to have images of all the individuals or anything like that once we have these general concepts. The concepts signify these individuals. And one might wonder, well, in virtue of what do they do it? And there's a debate in the literature. I've taken one stand. Uh, Others, for example, Colloquium, have taken another, as to whether or not there's something um, in the actual structure of the concept itself, which ties it to the individuals that it's of, or whether it's just the historical chain that does it, or there are all kinds of debates about that. That's not what I'm concerned with here. Here, by the way, is the text in which Occam actually tells you how this goes, right? I'll just leave it there for a second for those of you who prefer to think these things in Latin. Okay, now, on Occam's view, right, there are three levels of language. There's written language, there's spoken language, and there's mental language. The concepts that we've just been talking about signify individual things. That's the language. But written expressions, for example, um, pick out what they do. I use here mean, I probably shouldn't have, because they are subordinated to spoken expressions. Now, subordination is something that we do. We subordinate apparently by an act of will of some kind or something like it. We tie a written expression to a spoken expression, and we tie a spoken expression to a mental expression, i.e., to a concept that we have. And of course, there are various kinds of mental expressions. Occam talks about the absolute ones and uh, the, the connotative ones, which are concepts that are formed I think, by combinations of absolute concepts. And it's again a debated question in the literature whether we could acquire connotative concepts of things which we did not yet already have absolute concepts to, to make up the the structure. I think Claude, for example, thinks we could primitively acquire connotative concepts. I've claim that's not probably not so. Okay, now that's going back then. So once you've got these concepts, you can combine them into sentences, and that process of combination is just thinking. So if you look at, say, Occam or Jean Buridan, who has very similar views here, what you get are two kinds of concepts that can be combined. One kind are categorematic concepts, so they divide into the absolute concepts, which just pick out the things that they're concepts of, don't tell you anything about what those things are like or anything, they just pick them out. And the connotative concepts, which in some sense look like mental descriptions of things, right? So Occam's example, for example, of an absolute concept would be animal. It just picks out the animals, doesn't pick them out as living or as anything, just picks them out. That's all. Or whiteness, for example, because he thinks there are qualities. The connotative, some people call them, Buridan calls them relative, for example. Um, Concepts, on the other hand, pick out the things, but they pick them out, they signify them as being a certain way. So album, for example, which we might translate as white thing, picks out the white things, but it picks them out insofar as they're white. And if they cease to be white, it would stop picking them out, right? Rational works the same way. Okay, but there's another kind of concept, namely the syncategorematic concepts, which Occam wants to say modify signification. And of course, they're very much like what we would think of as logical constants, and they include the copula. So examples would be not, or is, or necessarily, or was, or will be, and so on, right? Now, uh, in the basic Occamist semantics, the categorematic terms signify, or at least they purport to, perhaps there can be categorematic terms that actually don't pick out anything. Perhaps there are connotative terms like round square, for example, which might not pick out anything, or chimera. Um, and then there are the syncategorematic terms, right? And the syncategorematic terms um, don't pick out things. That's the point. Okay, so now we know where the categorematic terms come from, right? We encounter things in the world and we generalize from them. That will give us absolute categorematic terms. We can combine them. That will give us connotative categorematic terms. And if someone like Claude is right, maybe we can acquire connotative uh, categorematic terms directly, but perhaps not, right? But where do the syncategorematic terms come from, right? That's, I think, the next question. After all, there aren't things in the world that we could pick out as nots or ises or ares or whatever, right? So we have three options, right? And I better fix this very quickly here. So one option is that we acquire them in the process of acquiring connotative categorematic terms, right? So that if, for example, you acquire the connotative term album, right, white thing, maybe you can, in that process, acquire the connotative term is and somehow get from white thing to thing is white. And that, I think, is the proposal that Claude and others have adopted. A second proposal is one I've adopted in the past, and that's the proposal just that these syncategorematic terms are innate. They're powers that our minds have for combining concepts, right? That's what we do. But here's a third option, that they're acquired from reflection on spoken language. And this is the proposal that Occam himself, at least one time, seems to have explicitly adopted, right? There's a time at which he seems to have held the astonishing view that all syncategorematic terms were derived from encounters with spoken language. Now, that's a view so astonishing that nobody that I know has been inclined to accept it, not even me, right? And here's the text. He says, matters are similar with this word not and with these per se, insofar as if and syncategoremata of this sort. From these words, so signifying, that is working not to pick things out, but to combine other things. The intellect abstracts common concepts predicable of them and imposes these concepts to signify these same things which those words signify outside the intellect, and in the same way and from such as these for it forms similar sentences having properties like those which the spoken sentences have. So this is in his sentence commentary, a fairly early work, but it's the ordinatio of his sentence commentary. So it's not something he didn't, think about. And people point out, oh yeah, at that point he still held a fictum theory for the development of concepts, not like the theory that we've talked about here earlier. And so presumably he just gave this up when he gave that up. But let's for the moment imagine that he hasn't. This is the only place, as far as I know, in the entire oeuvre in which he actually says how we acquire syncatogrammatic terms. Okay? So here's Normoore's old view, right? I should have an S there too. Sorry, I've been working very quickly because of what's been going on here. Um, the old view was that mental language plays a role, basically the role that lies behind spoken language in the way that we now think of as semantics lying behind a spoken language. So there are these four theses, right? That the signification of a spoken term is a function of that of the corresponding mental term, that the truth value of a sentence is a function of the truth value of the corresponding mental term, that if two expressions have the same corresponding mental expression, then they have the same signification, and that expressions with the same corresponding mental expression are interchangeable salvo veritate. So on that picture, mental concepts, or concepts, I guess we could say, just are playing the role of the meanings of the spoken and of the written expressions, right? Now, if you have that view, it seems very hard to think that these mental um, items themselves could somehow depend upon the spoken and written expressions, because after all, the spoken and written expressions wouldn't have any meaning if they if they weren't subordinated to these mental things, right? If these mental things didn't play that role for them, right? But Occam writes, right? Here's something that seems surprising. It's possible for somebody to impose this name A to signify whatever animal will appear to him tomorrow. Now, this being not to, remember, not to signify animal, but to signify that very thing that will appear to him tomorrow. This being done, the word a distinctly signifies this animal, and it will signify it for all those who are willing to use the word as it was imposed, even though the impositor himself, right, or herself, doesn't have a distinct intellection of this animal, and maybe will not have one when it appears to him. Right? So notice the force of this. Here I can use the word a. Okay, what am I using it to pick out? I'm using it to pick out, let's say, the first animal I will meet tomorrow. Now, I don't mean it, I'm not using it to mean the first animal I will pick out tomorrow, or sorry, I will see tomorrow. I'm using it to pick out that animal, right? That very thing. Maybe the first animal I see tomorrow, I won't even recognize to be an animal. Maybe I'll think it's a plant or or an artifact. But that's what A picks out, right? That's what I'm imposing A to pick out. Okay, let's let let's put Occam aside for a bit and turn to Pierre Dailly. So here's the beginning of Pierre Dailly's Conceptus. Here's what he says. He says, a sign that either from the imposition it actually has, or else from its nature, is, a sign is that which either from the imposition it actually has, or else from its nature, is fitted, is natum, to signify something or some things or somehow to a cognitive power by changing it vitally. And I'm quoting here from Paul Spade's translation, right? And Dailly goes immediately on, right, to add that the phrase from the imposition it actually has occurs in the above definition. God, I wish my spelling were better. uh, because of spoken and written terms, and now comes the punchline, mental ones improperly so called, which signify by imposition, right? Whereas the phrase, or else by its nature, occurs because of mental terms properly so called, which signify naturally. So Dai is distinguishing, and Occam himself in a couple of places comes very close anyway to distinguishing between mental terms properly so called, which are acquired in the way that we were looking at earlier, and mental terms improperly so called. And what it looks like mental terms improperly so called are the kinds of things that we saw in Dr. Klinger's presentation as well. They're, if you like, the mental impressions or reflections of the written or spoken terms that we have in our natural languages. So I take it the thought would be something like this. If you were a wild child and had not yet acquired language, you could certainly acquire mental concepts properly so called. But until you'd assign marks or sounds or something to them, there wouldn't be any mental terms improperly so called. Once you assigned a mark or a sound to one of your concepts, then you would have a second concept, which is a concept of the mark or sound in one way, but it's also a concept of whatever it is, the the mental concept properly so called that you have coordinated with this now by subordinating the say the spoken or the written mark to it. It also picks out what that signifies. So the thought that Dai is working with is if I use, say, the spoken sound animal, right? I might now conceive a concept in which the sound animal is what I'm conceiving, but I'm not merely conceiving it as a sound, like ba or something. I'm conceiving it as a term which picks out whatever that spoken term is itself subordinated to. So I'm imposing the improper mental term to pick to in subordination to a proper mental term. Now the question arises, do I have that proper mental term? Do I have to have it in order to do that? Right? And Dai explicitly includes syncategorematic terms under his definition, right? He actually says the word somehow is included because of terms that are syncategorematic by reason of signification. So I have these improper concepts, improper mental terms for not or is or things like that. Now, they are pre presumably pick out whatever it is or however it is that a corresponding mental term would, a proper mental term would pick out. But what is the corresponding proper mental term, right? Well, is it something I've already got, or is it something I now generate from my use of the improper mental term? And that seems to be what Dai is proposing. So he distinguishes two kinds of signifying. He says there's natural signifying and there's what you might call imposed signifying for the case of mental terms. So one kind of mental term is a mental term properly so called, and another is one that's improperly so called. And a mental term improperly so called, this by the way is again from his Conceptus, is a concept of an utterance or of an inscription synonymous with the utterance. Okay, so a concept like this is called a mental term improperly so called because such a concept, even though it naturally and properly signifies the utterance, right? It's a concept of, say the spoken sound not, or the inscription, yet at the same time can signify by convention, and that's ad placitum, the Latin, and be subordinated to another concept that signifies only naturally, right? And then he gives an example. He says the concept of the utterance man naturally and properly signifies the utterance man because it's its natural likeness. He's a likeness theorist, it seems. But ad placitum, right, it signifies every single man. And so is subordinated in signification to that concept, which is naturally and properly representative of all men. And it follows from this that the same mental term, improperly so called, is significative both naturally as a concept of the mental term itself and ad placitum by a convention. And what does he mean by convention? Well, to signify by convention is nothing other than an institution set up by the will and by the convention of some entire community or of someone who has authority and takes the place of the community to represent something or some things or somehow. So if we were to take this completely seriously and combine it with the thought about the animal that I'm going to encounter tomorrow, then the idea would be I learn a language. And in that language, let's suppose there's the copula is, right? And now I form a mental concept of that copula. And what do I intend that mental concept to signify? To signify whatever it is that is actually used for to pick out things, right? So how is used? Well, it's used to combine concepts into a proposition. And that's then how I'm using the expression is. Now, I might not even have thought about that before or done anything else, right? I'm piggybacking on the existing use of is, right? So Dai goes on to say an utterance that signifies by convention is one that when apprehended by hearing is apt by the imposition it actually has, not right, it whatever that is, to represent to a cognitive power by vitally changing it instrumentally, some things or somehow. And he's particularly worried about what, to rule out cases like where you might want to say a stone thinks or something because uh, the actual mental item, the quality that he thinks a mental item is, God has somehow managed to put into a stone. And he goes on a little further, actually, in his Insolubilia to say a little bit more. He says, on the other hand, there are other sentences that are images or likenesses of spoken or written ones, and they are either drawn into the soul from exterior utterances or inscriptions, or else are made up, right? So, of course, there's nothing to prevent me from making up a, um, a sound and subordinating it to some concept that I had. They're not of the same kind for all men, right? Rather, some are in Greek and others of signifying the same are in Latin. And in the same manner, the spoken or written sentences a Greek utters or utters outwardly are other than those signify sentences of the sort when he keeps silent with his mouth, but speaks with his heart by forming likenesses of what he would utter outwardly if he were to speak with his mouth. And therefore, although such sentences are naturally representations of utterances or inscriptions, they nevertheless represent utterance. They nevertheless represent ad placitum what is signified conventionally by such inscriptions or utterances. And notice those conventions are set up by the community or by someone who speaks in the name of the community. So it looks like, although he doesn't say it explicitly, it's perfectly consistent with and perhaps even required by Dai's picture that I have when I speak concepts that are derived from the actual use of the language that I'm engaged in, right? So that my concept of the copula, say, would be derivative upon my proper mental concept of the copula would be derivative upon my use of the spoken copula. And this raises, of course, the question in Arabic of what's playing that same role, but there you are. Maybe it's just the convention of the way that you put these terms together in the way that Dr. Klinger was pointing to. Okay, so my conclusion, if the picture I've painted is correct, then the mental language tradition not only has plenty of room for externalisms, both social and asocial, because of course, right, but may even be essentially social. If Occam didn't change his mind about syncagogrammatic terms, then they're dependent upon an existing spoken language. And if Dai's picture of improper mental language is in the same spirit as that, and Dai seems to be more or less self-consciously following this view, then contrary to what I've long claimed, mental language in the mind of a single agent is not semantically basic at all, right? Maybe, of course, there could be a isolated individual who acquires concepts. There's no problem with that. But mental language, which requires the composition of these concepts using syncatagramata, might not be possible for such a being. Okay, so this is the issue for an isolated original impositor, right? Imagine someone who's without language altogether and who's isolated from other humans. Could such a being develop language? Well, on the picture I've painted for Occam and for Dai, Occam, there'd be no problem acquiring concepts, right? You can acquire concepts with it. And one assumes no problem in subordinating sounds or marks to them. But could they combine these into propositions and sentences? For that, they would need syncatagramata, and without language to derive these from, right? Without language to derive these from, there would have to be either innate or acquired along with the concepts they are acquiring. It would seem then that for such an impositor, mental syncatagramata must be more basic than spoken ones. So that's the problem. If you imagine now the beginnings of language, so imagine a species without language. They've got concepts, right, because they acquire them in the way Occam's goes. They don't yet have any syncatagrammatic expressions. Where could they get them? Well, they can't get them from spoken or written language because that doesn't exist yet. They must either have them innately or they must acquire them in the way Claude Panazio and others think with the connotative concepts that they get. So there's a bootstrapping problem. But of course, that's not our problem, right? We're not original impositors in that sense. We enter a linguistic community, you know, that's already fully fledged in some sense. Now, of course, we might be original impositors for some terms, right? I mean, proper names, for example. I use the term Aristotle to pick out Aristotle. I've never met Aristotle and never will, right? Barring some afterlife in which we both are. And yet, it's Aristotle that I'm thinking about when I think Aristotle, right? And of course, there are terms that we invent as we go. I mean, my example here is the Higgs boson. Well, it turns out there is a Higgs boson, and that's what we're talking about, right? But it's not at all clear that we could learn to think propositionally, right? To think propositionally before we learn to speak in sentences. So the original impositor is a problem, but that. So perhaps the original impositor on the Ockhamist picture is in a position very like that of Aquinas and Aristotle. They have accounts of how concepts are acquired, but no account of which I'm aware of how these are combined, not into complex ideas, but into propositions. And of course, when we turn away from mental language in the 16th century to people like Descartes, what we find is a theory of ideas and actually no theory at all of how propositions are developed. So the mental language theorists do have such an account, which for us has a social dimension, but I don't see how they can extend that account into a an account of how the original imposition of language develops. All right. So um, as my slide here says, you're not a true Canadian until you apologized for saying sorry too much. So let me say how sorry I am, both for the state of those slides and for the incomplete state of this talk. I really think something, I mean, it's like scales have fallen from my eyes, but nothing yet has replaced them. And I really do not now know how to understand how this kind of mental language works. So thank you very, very much.